I am joined today by a couple of my colleagues. Jackie and Lisa, why don't you introduce yourselves, and then we'll introduce Sarah and Minka as well as our collaborators. So Jackie, I have you first under me on my photos here.
Like the Brady Bunch.
Yes.
Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My dog just absolutely started barking as soon as it was my turn to speak, so apologies for that. My name is Jackie Gruber. I'm a white European settler of Jewish descent, and my pronouns are she and her. And I work as the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Rady Faculty of Health Sciences at University of Manitoba. And it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Monkman. I'm Anishinaabe and I'm a family physician here in Manitoba. I'm the PGME Indigenous Health Curriculum lead at the University of Manitoba.
And our other friends and colleagues and collaborators on this work is Sarah Goulet, who is also a family physician and the Associate Dean of Admissions at the University of Manitoba with the Max Rady College of Medicine, and Minka Chan, who's a pediatrician in Winnipeg, and she's the co-director of the Office of Leadership Education with the Max Rady College of Medicine. And so we have been working together, honestly, as an opportunity for us to have fun and do a collaborative project together, but really working on this topic of diversity in admissions and really trying to bridge that the continuum from undergrad to postgrad admissions within medicine.
Where we're speaking from today in Manitoba, we're located on Treaty 1 territory, so home of the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene, and homeland of the Métis Nation as well. And so what I always like to think when land acknowledgements are being read, and reflect on what does that mean to you. So when I think of what that means to myself, it means locating myself on the land, as you'll note that I did earlier on as a white European settler, and also my identity and my background. So you just know a little bit more about myself too. It also means kind of reflecting on the true histories and learning about the true histories of the past, and know that we have so much work to do towards reconciliation in the future as well. So when they're being read, always think to yourself, what does this mean to me? How can I personalize this to myself? So I just wanted to share a bit of that.
And I think as we are talking about diversity and in postgraduate medical education for us in Manitoba, and for me personally, in the when we think about and share our land acknowledgement, it's really, I think about our responsibility as we have the privilege to work and live on the land here, and our responsibility as healthcare providers to provide and improve the care of the population and the people that are our neighbors in Manitoba. And for us, what this also means is addressing the disparities and the gaps in health outcomes, and in the Indigenous and First Nations peoples' health outcomes in Manitoba. This was a report from the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy in 2019 that really highlighted the gap in health outcomes between the First Nation people's health outcomes in Manitoba compared to other Manitobans. And of course, in COVID, we are seeing this happen in real time. And the impacts of historic systemic racism and historic colonial structures. And so this really grounds us in why this diversity work is so important as a measure, or as a way to address some of this, some of the disparities, is to really address our health workforce and improving the diversity and addressing the gaps in diversity in the health workforce. So in terms of disclosures, we don't have anything specific to declare other than we're all employees of the University of Manitoba with our academic work. So in terms of the objectives for our workshop this afternoon, we have 45 minutes together, and we want to talk about how selection policies and processes may disadvantage some applicants. We want to specifically take some time to identify opportunities to mitigate bias and improve selection processes and policies within our own contexts, so that hopefully when you leave the workshop today, you will be able to take some of this back and to think about your own process and how you may be able to make some improvements. So first, to get us started, we're going to get you to use the chat and to think about, how do you feel about applicant selection? And in this context, we're specifically sort of thinking about PGME today, but certainly across the continuum and also across health professions. And so how does this make you feel? So you can just use the chat, jot in some initial thoughts about this. I often feel overwhelmed when I think about applicant selection. And now we've recently just finished up the second iteration of CaRMS. And certainly for some programs, and certainly at the University of Manitoba this year, the second iteration of CaRMS ended up being a lot of work, as we had a number of unfilled spots within our department and really tight turnarounds in the second iteration. So it then leads to a lot of work to be able to move through there. Imperfect and variable, absolutely. And potentially biased, absolutely. And I think the subjectivity of it is a really important part. And I think that we'll sort of allude to that in some ways. And you try to be objective about each applicant, but it can be biased, absolutely, if you recognize the applicants. And so we'll sort of come to that later when we talk about blinding as a component to address bias. Cautiously optimistic, I like. Oh, and I really enjoy it, says Tiffany. That's amazing. And I think that's another piece of it, is that the applicant selection process can be quite enjoyable in a lot of ways when we think about this as this opportunity to highlight ourselves and our program and the work that we do that we feel so passionate about, that it can really be, it can be engaging to sort of bring people along with us as we move through the process. And I think that the comment here around objectivity wanes if there's a large number of applications. And I think that this is one of the pieces that when we talk about this topic, we do sort of think of it with this big umbrella, applicant selection, but specifically in postgrad, there's a big spectrum from little tiny programs, that get just a handful of applications and may not even fill every year, to big programs. I think about family medicine as being its own kind of separate beast when it comes to selection. And we often try and apply the same sort of processes to these big programs that may not actually be a fair approach given the volume and things like that. All right, thank you for your responses.
I think when we've done this exercise in the past, other words they reflect on are scary, overwhelming as well. So I appreciate some of the comments that people put in the chat too. And so just to ground ourselves as well today, really when we talk about equity, many times people will go to that kind of depiction of the poster where there's people behind a fence and they're watching a baseball game, and talks about equality where everyone gets the same box, not everyone can see over, etc. This is a pretty well-known graphic depiction. And really what I like is this is an article on race, metaphor, and myth in academic medicine, and this depiction's a bit different. And so in this article they talk about how academic medicine perpetuates this myth that racially excluded and qualified candidates are inherently scarce and are in need of recruitment, while in the same time academic medicine participates directly in manufacturing these conditions that make the field inhospitable to racial candidates. And so on the depiction you see on the slide, there's 3 individuals here and they're all of equal stature. So it's not in the previous poster I talked about, they're all of equal stature. However, they're experiencing external forces that distort how tall they appear. So this image really reveals the biased foundational beliefs about innate differences in value or merit that often undermine the success of equity-based interventions as well. So I would urge people, if you haven't seen this article, to obtain it and to read it as well. So really, when we're talking about biases, we want to think about how can we do better, and how we can do better is looking at a transparent process in particular. So we need to understand our biases. We need to raise awarenesses of what they are. We also need to use best practices, focus on equitable processes, and be clear and transparent too. So if we can have that anchor, some of the comments that I heard earlier on about how objectivity can wane if you have a large number of applicants to review, for example. I think someone also talked about the large number brings a filter, and that filter can equate to biases in essence as well. So if we can think about processes that help to anchor that and be clear and transparent, that will assist in that too as well. So, when we think of what else can we do, I really like this quote. This is from Dr. Quinn Capers from Ohio State University at that time. And he talked about how diversity among health sciences professionals is critically important to reducing health disparities, and reducing implicit bias is key to a diverse medical workforce as well. And so, when you think about it, health science professionals wield powerful influences over the health of the nation. And in the face of that power, you have an obligation to identify and to remediate your implicit biases, whether that's based on race, gender, sexual orientation, skin color, weight, abilities, age, or other characteristics. So there's certain things that we have to do with these obligations as well. And I think of self-awareness and constantly questioning oneself too, in terms of where do ideas come from. So we're going to play a game. All right, this is one of my favorite parts. And this is an association game. And so what I ask is that everyone turn on your microphone, and hopefully you're able to, wherever you're located today. And I'm going to read out one word at a time. And if that word is associated with male or liberal arts, I want you to call out left. If it's associated with female or science, I want you to call out right. And Amanda, do you want to actually call out the words? Is that okay? Because you're in control of the slide.
For sure.
Okay. And I want you to call it out as quickly as possible. So don't think about it. Just, Amanda will say a word. If it's male or liberal arts, left, female or science, right. Does anyone have any questions? Are we good?
All right, we're good.
Okay. Wonderful.
Father.
Left.
Engineering.
Right.
Music.
Left.
Daughter.
Right.
Uncle.
Left.
Math.
Right.
Girl.
Right.
Literature.
Left.
Husband.
Left.
Physics.
Right.
Okay, so what did you notice about that activity? Did you have to think about it?
Yeah, the hesitation was audible. Meaning that we were all thinking hard.
I agree with Dr. Chan. She mentioned the priming. I think you put, female in science and male or liberal arts. That I guess that was the purpose of the exercise, right? To make us think.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to admit, so when I have done this in the past, when I've set this exercise up in the past, I will say, if the word is associated with male or science, I will say that when I have the slide in front of me say male or liberal arts. I will divert to that. It will just come out of my mouth without me even thinking about it as well. And so anyone else want to share? I see some other comments in here. So gender bias, usual relationship is male science versus female liberal arts, and our brains as well. Absolutely. So I think this is like just it's a quick example of the implicit association test from Harvard University. It's a free test. I'm sure people are familiar with that, of different categories. I always take a few of different categories a few times over the year. It will tell you in terms of where your biases are as well. But this is just a quick example. I always say that individuals, especially when I do training on search committees or admissions committees, that they should take the implicit association test, just to give you some idea. And so, oh, great, thank you. It's in the chat perfectly. So really, this is just an example in terms of some of our biases. And I think, scientists will estimate that we can be bombarded with as many as like millions of pieces of information at a time, but our brains can only cognitively handle so many pieces as well. And so we create these mental shortcuts based on how we grew up, our culture, the media surrounding us as well. And we can divert to those shortcuts too. There's like 4 key conditions where our biases are activated. So stress, multitasking, time, and need for closures. So think about if you have a large number of applicants, for example, you've already referenced how your objectivity can wane, but you can see if you're experiencing those key conditions, how you just go to those mental shortcuts that your brain has created as well. So when we talk about diversity in admission processes or in search processes as well, we have to look at what are our individual biases as one of the starting places, but not just the only starting place as well. When we think of science in particular, in the science ecosystem, we also have to consider racism as well. And we have to consider that the systemic racism is an interconnected system too. So we have to look at not just our individual biases, but we have to look at the structures that support this. And we need to, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about equity inclusion, we have to talk about racial equity, we have to talk about racism as well. And so this is just a depiction on the slide. And really, by definition, racism is a deeply embedded historical system of unequal institutional power. It's not fluid and doesn't change direction. It's seen as an interlocking and reciprocal relationship between the individual, the institutional, and structural levels that function as a system of racism. And these various levels of racism operate and function together as a whole system. And when we consider racism that exists in Canada today, it's deeply rooted in Canada's history of colonialism and establishment of legal and social structures and institutions that inherently oppress BIPOC individuals too. And so when we think of racism, it's entrenched in our day-to-day lives, including in our policies, our practices, and in our institutions. And these can be difficult to recognize if you're not from a group who particularly experiences this as well. And so conjunction with structural racialization. And these are huge, like 2 powerful forces that create barriers and impede access to opportunity amongst many critical life domains too. When we think of structural biases and racism are really part of the science ecosystem. So we have to interrupt it at both levels as well.
So I'm going to take us over to mentimeter.com, and we're going to ask some specific questions around your application or your applicant selection process. So you can use the camera on your phone, hold up to the QR code, and this will take you over to the Mentimeter link. Or if you type menti.com into the browser, and then I'll have the numerical code for you right away. I'm going to take us over to the poll right now. And so if you've typed menti.com into your browser, then the numerical code that you'll enter in is 60783878. And so our first question here is looking at which elements does your selection process include or consider? And so you should be able to select more than one of these. So we've got academic standardized test scores, reference letters, panel interviews, grades, personal letters from applicants, situational judgment testing scores, and multiple mini interviews. So interesting to me around the situational judgment test scores. We're talking about PGME selection here, and at the University of Manitoba, we last year implemented that all of our postgraduate programs had to include situational judgment testing scores in their selection process. So interesting. Certainly, I know there's been more uptake in undergrad nationally, but we're using it in postgrad as well. Okay, so I'm going to take us to our next question here, which is, what does your program do to improve diversity or address bias as part of your selection? It's okay if the answer here is nothing or I don't know, because I think that this is part of what there's starting to be more conversation about this. I think part of our work here in postgrad is that there has been a lot of focus on this in undergrad. So many programs are talking about the policies and things that have been put in place in terms of their undergrad admission process into medical school. But then when we don't necessarily apply this along the continuum, which we'll get to in a subsequent slide in postgrad, then we're perhaps not creating the processes that we need to ensure that that diversity or those diverse medical students have equitable access to any program in postgrad. So we've got some new rubrics, mandatory training for all that are shortlisting and interviewing, high variability and difference amongst programs. And exactly, undergrad admissions does a better job. I think that the variability and the programs, some programs being more progressive in this regard than others, speaks to that slide that Jackie had about our the external and internal factors. And so we can think about that as, what is our role as an institution for setting sort of expectations for programs, and then where is the space for programs to make their own selection determinations. And here we are also seeing training for interviewers and recruitment of diverse representation for our admission process. Okay, excellent. So our next question here is, what are your program's explicit diversity goals? So is there something written down or an approach that your program takes to specify what they're specifically looking for from a diversity perspective? Again, it's okay if the answer here is I don't know or nothing for this question. And then certainly some of the talks that we heard earlier around quality improvement can speak to are there specific metrics or has your program identified sort of an explicit goal when it comes to diversity in terms of recruitment? So representative of the population we serve, looking to increase male representation in a female dominated profession. And I think that the not explicit goals, I think, is also something important to consider in terms of, is that an opportunity when things aren't explicit? How does bias can potentially creep in? One of the things that we've talked about before when we've done this workshop and had this conversation before is when you want to have a goal of prioritizing local applicants. So for us in Manitoba, our goals are always to keep people in Manitoba. And so when we have that as an explicit goal, what are the impacts on diversity and how may that have some impact? And one last question before I take us back to the slides is, what are the elements or what may be some of the elements of the selection process within your program or institution that you're most worried about that may have some bias or may be contributing to bias within your selection processes? I think some of the things we heard in the chat earlier in terms of the number of applications and how to appropriately kind of apply those filters is certainly for me one of the areas where I worry about bias. And as Jackie was mentioning with those, the 4 criteria that sort of prime us or put us where our bias is more likely to come to the forefront is just the sheer volume and amount of time and energy that is being put into this, that then the workload and the fatigue factor can really factor in and can really have an impact. So that conscious awareness, absolutely not enough training. I think what we have seen locally at our institution is we're not all on the same page of recognizing the importance of bias in our processes, and that there is still a lot of commitment to the historic way of doing things. And so we're not necessarily at a place where we're moving forward. Okay, I'm going to bring us back to the presentation. Thank you all for your responses here. So certainly when we talk about PGME resident selection, we recognize that this happens, selection happens along a continuum. And when we're selecting residents into our programs, much selection has already happened, right? So we've talked about UGME admissions, but even before UGME, and we know for historically underrepresented groups that there's much upstream work that needs to happen in order for us to be able to even look at a diverse applicant pool when it comes to our resident selection. And there's many factors that go into what sort of program a resident chooses or a medical student chooses as their future career. And that work is also important. I would argue that in PGME, we also need to have a role in influencing the programs that students choose. But our focus of our conversation today is really just to think about the elements of PGME resident selection. So the file review, interview selection, the interview process itself, and determination of that final rank order list. I'm going to hand it back over to Jackie here to talk a little bit about bias in admissions.
So this was a study done or research done in 2017, again by Dr. Capers and others at Ohio State University. And anyone who was involved, this was an undergraduate medical education admissions process, had to take the implicit association test. And I believe it was race, gender, and sexual orientation, those three categories they were asked to take. And then those individuals were surveyed after. And so they were asked questions in terms of how helpful they thought taking the IAT was. And so the majority felt it was helpful in reducing their bias. Almost half were conscious of their individual IET results when they were interviewing candidates, and 21% stated that their IET results impacted their admissions decisions. But really, to me, the proof that's in the pudding, so to speak, is that that class that was admitted following was the most diverse class in the history. So it does say something of what we need to do to remediate our own biases and to explore what our biases are. But we also have to look at the structures too and what to support it. So when we think of biased indicators of excellence. So really, what is the definition of the most qualified in essence? And so standards that are previously seen as being objective and reliable include, some examples are like rotation evaluations, the MMI, for example, personal interviews, letters of references, years of experience, number of publication size of grants as well in particular. And really all of these are subject to unconscious bias as well when you think about it too. And I always like to take a step back and think, like, who decides what excellence is? Take that step back. Who's making those decisions? Where is that coming from? Is it based on Western colonial patriarchal heteronormative culture, for example? Why is that, right? So we have to change our thinking and look at what else can we be doing differently. And then the next slide just discusses an article, because, if we're wanting to increase diversity in our fields, we also have to ensure that the environment is safe, not just safe, but also welcoming, where individuals have a sense of belonging. So this is from an article on Interviewed While Black. And the individual here talks about how during the course of the interview, the Black applicant was asked whether they were lost, and also assumed that we were not an applicant, and also that they were told they had an unusual name, and and that they were articulate, for example, just some points in the article. So thinking about how welcoming are you to your applicants as well, so that they want to come and attend your institution as well. Some other considerations too.
The ACGME in the US, they describe a framework for inclusive graduate medical education recruitment strategies. And so sort of apply this or suggest this multi-pronged approach to address diversity within our postgraduate training environments. And within this, talk about doing a holistic review of the applicant pool, such that we're able to make this more individualized, and that we provide more balanced consideration of experiences, personal attributes, and academic achievement, rather than strictly focusing on academics or those kind of traditional expectations of academic achievement from research and scholarly output and things like that. And so to really think about how we're rating and determining who's the best fit, and I'm using fit in quotations because that is a challenge when it comes to selection as well. So I just want to quickly focus in on the interview as a very specific example to get us thinking about how our processes and things that we put in place can incorporate bias into our selection. So if we think about the interview, so we've got the format, the questions, who the interviewers are, what the day looks like. And so some of the things to think about and where some of that potential structural and systemic bias may creep in is things like, how are the interview questions and rubric decided upon? And how are the interviewers selected, oriented, and trained? We heard about that in some of the Mentimeter polling. And how is the interview format decided upon? And underlying all of this is who decided that and who was at the table to make these decisions. When we think about our processes, when it comes to selection, we also need to think about transparency and accountability. And what are the common knowledge parts of our application process? And how do applicants find out about that common knowledge? And who might be missing out if we have these things that are sort of ingrained and felt to be inherent? The other piece is, if your selection process was questioned, how firmly would you stand behind it? And then we come back to this measurement piece and sort of always looping this back into this kind of quality improvement sort of lens is, what are the metrics that you're using within your selection process? And how do you know that the steps that you're taking actually work? And then this comes back to our goals, and what are the goals when it comes to selection? And then when you make changes, we read about some changes within the Mentimeter responses in terms of developing new rubrics and things like that. And so how are those changes assessed, and how do you know if they work or if they've made the changes that you're hoping to see? So now I'm going to take us into an example, and we're going to spend the last 10 minutes of our time together sort of thinking through this example. So I'd like to introduce you to Program X. This is a postgraduate program. It's a moderately sized 5-year program. Typically, they accept between 4 and 6 students or residents per year, and they generally receive about 100 applications per year. As part of the initial review, anyone whose applications are missing documents are removed or not, they don't move forward into the next review. And they do use situational judgment testing as sort of a benchmark, and anyone who has a Z score of less than minus 1.28 is also removed, so they don't progress through the selection process. They offer about 50 interviews a year, so about half of their applicants are offered an interview. The interviews themselves are a panel interview that consists of their program director, a faculty member, and a chief resident from their program. The interviews are scored using a rubric. Each interviewer individually scores the interview, and then those scores are sort of averaged to come to a total score. The rubric is sort of focused around elements and weighted towards formal leadership, research and publications, as well as a demonstrated commitment to the field. And then the final ranking is determined by discussion between the group discussion and determined by the program director and the selection committee. So I want us to think about those elements as they've been outlined, and to think about where the potential for bias may lie within the process as it's been described. And as we're thinking about bias and how that may creep in, we also want to think about who might Program X be missing with the process or the that they're using for selection, or the elements that they're using. So we're going to try using the annotation tools here within Zoom. So at the top of your screen, you should have the annotate tool, which is the little pencil that you can select, and then you can either use the text or the drawing or the stamp. And as we look at these elements, I want you to sort of highlight which of these do you feel could be bringing bias into the process, or which of the things would you be most concerned about bringing bias into their process? So again, the annotation is the little pencil at the top, and then excellent. So we've got some highlight here around the situational judgment scores using the Z scores, absolutely. The research and publications. The final ranking is so in that discussion piece around how they, and if anyone wants to unmute and pop in with some commentary here, that's great as well. So what I want us to think about now for our last few minutes here is to think about those things that we highlighted, and to think about what are some simple changes that Program X could apply to reduce some of the bias within their program or within their process. And so to do this, we're going to consider a 15% solution. So 15% solutions are things that are relatively easy to change. They could be small changes, and we say that they're within the sphere of influence of the program. So the thing I say here is that this is not a change that's going to need approval by Senate. This is something that could be done within the program itself to make their process a little bit better. It has no or little cost tied to it, and it could be implemented tomorrow, so that if we had to do CaRMS again tomorrow, we could make a small change that would potentially have some benefit. And then when we think about this, of course, we always think about, well, how are we going to know? This brings us back to our quality improvement language. How are we going to know that the change has made a difference? And so what could be some metrics? So I would like people to take sort of a few seconds here to really reflect on this. What is one simple change? I'd like people to document in the chart, or sorry, in the chat about what a 15% solution could be that Program X could apply to their process. And we can type away in the chat, and then we'll all kind of hit enter together and review and spend our last few minutes together reflecting here on some of these changes.